Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting a mini flower shop. I know I've made larger one before, but I personally just love smaller paintings, so I made a smaller version of a flower shop with a different type of building. So let's begin by sketching it out. I'm just going to create a really simple rectangle here as the main structure of the building, and at this point I just want to make sure I like the scale of the main subject matter compared to the paper size that I have. So this is the basic shape of the building. It's just a trapezium roof with a rectangular exterior. I decided to shorten the height because I want to paint a tree to frame the building. And before I add on any details, I just want to make sure that this basic structure is as accurate and clean as I can get it to be, so it's much easier to draw the rest of the features. Here I'm quite happy with the scale and the structures. So I'm going to start drawing on the bushes and trees to frame the building just so I know what it looks like. I'm doing this very lightly and loosely because personally I like to freehand paint the bushes and trees later on. After that, I'm going to start sketching out the features of the building, like the door here on the right hand side. I made it quite high so I can add stairs with potted plants on either side. For the window on the left, I decided to include a fun shape because I want this to look a bit more whimsical. So instead of the usual rectangles or squares, I decided to create this fun short arch shape with a little bit of a thick frame and of course more plants in front of the windowsill. In front of the building, of course, I'm going to add displays of plants, so I'm just going to add on some shorter and taller pots. For the potted plants, I just drew out a really loose sketch of the plant's silhouette. That's because just like the trees and the bushes, I like to freehand paint them later on. This wasn't in my initial sketch for my ideation process, but I decided to include a little green patch on the side of the roof because I just find that this will be a nice addition to make the whole composition look more whimsical. And lastly, I divided the areas of the roof for the roof tiles, as well as add additional decorations like the signage in front. As for the colors, I'll be using Chinese White by Holbein, Prussian Blue by Holbein, Quin Red by Daniel Smith, Vermilion by Holbein, Sap Green by Holbein, New Gamboge by Daniel Smith, Sepia by Holbein, and Blue Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martens. I also ended up outlining using my Sakura Micron pen in Sepia. Let's begin to paint. I'm going to create a warm green from a mix of New Gamboge, Sap Green, and Vermilion to start painting the green patch on the roof. I'm just tapping using the tip of my brush while playing around with the angle in order to suggest the texture of leaves. While I'm doing this, I like to play around with the ratio. So for the top of the roof, I try to use more of a yellow-green since the light will be coming from there. And as I get towards the bottom, I like to alternate between the lighter yellow-green and the darker green, which has more sap green and a thicker consistency. By playing with the angle and just the tapping of my brush, you can see that I've left out some white negative space here and there as well, and that's completely fine. In fact, it'll make the composition look less dense. And here, as the surface is still a bit damp, I went in with a darker green using the same previous mix with added sepia, and I just find that this will give a little bit of volume to the patch of green. Here I'm also creating a similar texture by playing with the angle of the tip of my brush, using just a thick consistency of vermilion to the big flowers. Then I switched to my small brush and created a dark red by adding a bit of sepia in the mix to paint some shadows underneath those flowers. Next, I'm going to create a pink from a mix of Quin Red and Chinese White, and I also added vermilion to soften the pink slightly. And here I didn't get it on camera, but I painted ovals by twirling my brush around in different sizes, for the base color of the roses, and then I'm going back in with a thicker consistency of the same mix with less Chinese white in the ratio to paint on more of those swirls using a dry brush load depicting the loose shape of these roses. For the next flowers, I'm going to be using a thin to medium consistency of new Gamboge to paint the base color. I also switched to my Filbert brush here. I'm creating random shapes, but for the ones in front or closer to us, I made the shapes a little bit more thick, whereas the ones at the back are thinner and closer together to make it look like they're wrapping around this plant. As for the shadows underneath, to make it look more plump, I used a mix of new Gamboge with Vermilion. Let's mix up a different color. This time I'm going to be using Prussian blue, Quin Red, and Chinese white for this pastel purple. And because the flowers on these pots are going to be small, I'm just sticking to my size 0 brush. As for the shadow on this, I used the same mixture with less Chinese white, and I'm going to apply it to the bottom of these tall flowers. And in between these pots, I'm going to use a mix of Prussian blue and Chinese white for some pastel blue flowers. I want the flowers to be small, so I'm just creating dots in different clumps. As for the darker value, I just use Prussian blue to paint underneath some of these dots. I'm also going to add flowers behind the yellow ones. I used the purple mix for this, but it has less Prussian blue, so it's a little bit more pink, and I'm also going to apply the same on the right-hand side. Same goes for the shadow or the darker value. I used the same mix with less Chinese white, so the color is darker and less pastel. Now let's fill in the greeneries or the leaves between the flowers that we just previously painted. In terms of application, I'm only treating this one differently because I wanted to include the sepal as well as the stem of some of these roses. But for the greens or the leaves, I'm just going to treat them the same way as how I painted most of the flowers. For the tone of green, I'm not going to tell you specifically what I did here, but I will tell you how to mix up your own green so you can adjust it to your liking. I use Sap Green as my main dominant green, and if I wanted to turn to a light yellow green, I would add new Gamboge. For a cooler temperature and slightly richer green, I would add Prussian blue. For a warmer tone of green, I would add a little bit of Vermilion as the opposite color of green, and Sepia to darken the value. All this said, you can still mix all of these colors together and play with the ratio to create different tones depending on whatever looks best with your flowers. But generally, I like to apply the lighter values before applying the darker values for the shadows like what I'm doing here. For the dense flower at the back, since most of the greeneries will be hidden underneath, I just use the darker value without adding any bright greens. At the back here, I want to paint on some green leaves creeping horizontally. Just like the rest of the things that we've already painted, I used a lighter value or a lighter green for the top and a darker one at the bottom. I also switched to my Filbert brush because it was a larger area to paint on, and while I still have the green, I also painted the leaves underneath the red flowers. Initially, this was supposed to be one tree, but I decided to separate it into two because I just want an excuse to paint on more flowers for more colors. So I decided to turn this smaller one into a jacaranda tree. For the purple, I just used the same mix of Prussian blue, Quin Red, and Chinese white. And to paint on these flowers, I just wiggle my brush from the top to the bottom, and as I get towards the bottom, I made the tip a bit smaller and thinner. And here I'm going back in with a darker value by using the same mix with less Chinese white, and I'm also using a thicker consistency to paint in between the flowers. For a bit of color variation, I also added a bit of pink around the edges, and here I use a light pastel green by adding Chinese white into the mixture, and I also added some curved lines or arching lines to suggest some of the stems for the flowers. Now to match the yellow flowers by the stairs, I decided to paint some yellow flowers on the larger tree. When I was painting this, I was thinking of 5-petaled flowers, but I was just painting it loosely and quickly, so they all look fairly loose and not perfectly shaped, but I like to keep it that way. And just like the previous yellow flower, I used a mix of New Gamboge and Vermilion for this orange, and I'm going to paint it underneath some of the flowers to give volume. Just like the potted flowers, now I'm going to fill in the white space with leaves. I chose a yellow-green from a mix of Sap Green and New Gamboge, and I'm placing this on the top left side of each tree clump. Then I'm going to follow this up with a darker green for the rest of the empty spaces. With the rest of the yellow-green that I still have on my palette, I'm going to use a thin to medium consistency to paint the bushes framing the building. And for this, I'm just using a heavy load so I can cover a huge area all at once. And I'm going to follow this up by adding sap green into the previous mixture and painting it on the inner part so the edges are lighter than the inside. For the previous bush, the leaves were long, so for this one, I'm going to make them shorter, but I want to make sure that the edges are not perfectly rounded so they look a bit more textured and natural. The bushes on the left look a little bit too green and too dense, so I'm going to break up the green by dotting in some orange from New Gamboge and Vermilion. Now let's move on to the roof tiles. I'm using the rest of the orange that I still have on my palette, which is from New Gamboge and Vermilion. I also added a little bit of sepia to mute the color slightly so it becomes more of a reddish brown or an orange brown. I'm going to cover this whole area, but I like to alternate the colors slightly by changing up the ratio. So this darker color that I'm painting right now has a bit more sepia in the mix, and this color variation will just make the roof tiles look less flat. With the same color mixture, I'm going to paint the window frame and the door frame. For the decorative bricks on the left side, I use the same mixture, but this has a little bit more sepia, so it's a bit darker in value. Here, as you can see, I'm alternating the way I paint the bricks. That's because I don't want these colors to just blend into each other, and waiting and leaving them to dry will separate those shapes instead of them blending into each other if they're wet. For the rest of the exterior here, I used a similar mixture as the roof with added Chinese white and a bit more New Gamboge, and I'm just going to spread it evenly. For the support beam, I used the same mix with added vermilion and sepia. I'm just going to paint it all over. Then I switched to my small brush to paint right underneath the roof since it's a little bit wavy. I'm still using similar color mixtures. This time it has New Gamboge, Vermilion, and Chinese white for the terracotta pots. And between those pots, I used the sepia and vermilion mix to separate those lighter pots, and I also used the same color to paint on the window frames. To keep it simple, I'm just going to paint a tinted window, so for this I used a mix of sepia and Prussian blue. I'm using my Filbert brush to paint this, but if you have a small flat brush, that would also make it much easier to control. With the same dark brown mix, I'm going to use it to paint the shadow underneath the roof, and this will just separate the beam and the roof a little bit further, making the beam look like it's placed a bit deeper. I'm also going to line the underneath of these bricks on the side to separate them further and add a bit of volume. Still using the same mixture again, I'm going to apply it to the side of the steps, and I'm just going to paint it flatly before separating the brick texture. Now with the thicker consistency, I painted the top part since I want it to be in shadow from the pots. For the top of these steps, I used a mix of Prussian blue, sepia, and Chinese white for this neutral gray. Then for the front face, I'm just going to use the dark browns from before. The reason why I chose these two different colors is to separate the top and the front face of the stairs, but of course you can also choose other colors as well. At first I wanted to create a slight variation by creating these brick textures, but I ended up just going over them again, so don't worry about these lines in between. Now let's move on to the pots. I'm still using the same mixture from New Gamboge, Vermilion, and Sepia, again playing with different ratios to create different terracotta colors. With more sepia in the mixture, I'm going to use it to paint underneath the flowers as cast shadow. There's a lot of orange browns already for the building, so for the door I'm creating something a bit different. I added a lot of Prussian blue into the previous brown mix to create a muted blue color, and I'm going to paint it all over the door. Then with a thicker consistency of the same color, I'm going to outline the door itself, and I want the frame of the door to look like it's protruding more than the door itself. And I'm also going to use the same color to paint the rest of the details of the door. I'm going to wait for these to dry and move on to paint the tiles of the roof. This is from a mix of sepia and vermilion, and I'm just going to line whatever I've sketched out before as the perspective of the roof. Then I switched to my size 0 brush to make it easier to paint on more lines. This time it's going to be curved horizontal lines within the vertical lines that I painted earlier. Now let's build on the contrast. Here I'm working on the green patch on top of the roof again, applying more of the darker green underneath the main patch to again give it volume. And I also want to start painting on the cast shadows from the plants on the exterior walls. For the cast shadow, I'm just going to follow the color of whatever surface I'm painting on. So for this one, I'm just creating a darker version of the same base color. And it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be a darker version of the same color. So here I used the previous orange mix with a bit of sepia and also Chinese white so it doesn't lose the pastel tone. And as for the roof, as well as the areas with the darker brown, I used the same dark brown mix from sepia and vermilion. For the door, of course, I just used the same mix in a thicker consistency since the base color was painted quite lightly. And in terms of the shadows, I tried to paint long diagonal leaf textures behind and slightly underneath the trees and plants. I kind of realized that the direction of the shadow is not exactly correct though, since I want most of the light to come from the top left, so the cast shadow should tilt to the right instead. But it's a bit too late now, so I'll just try to keep it in mind the next time I paint these imaginative buildings to be a bit more consistent and mindful of these things. Since I still want some cast shadows to be painted on the windows, here I use a thicker consistency from a mix of Prussian blue and sepia. Then using the same mix with more sepia in the ratio, I painted on the brick textures for the side of the steps. And I'm going to randomize this color for the front face of the steps as well to suggest some natural stones. Still using the same dark brown mix, I'm going to fill in the space in between the pots as well. Now for the floor, I'm going to use a muted brown color. This was from the orangey brown mix with Chinese white, and this time I added some Prussian blue to mute it further. I'm using a thin consistency, and to follow the direction of the cast shadow, I'm just going to paint this diagonally as well. And then using a slightly thicker consistency, I painted closer to the objects so the color isn't too flat. For the signage, I used a mix of New Gamboge and sepia and also had a little bit of vermilion there. I used a thin consistency to paint the front face, then I use a thicker consistency after the surface is completely dry for the inner part of the signage. Now let's bring the tree to life by painting on the stems and branches. For this, I used a thick consistency mix of sepia, bit of Prussian blue, and vermilion. And using my size 0 brush, I want to make sure I paint branches in between some of the tree spaces as well. This will give a bit of breathing space, since before, without the branches, it looks like a huge clump of leaves. Then after that, I'm just going to outline some of the details using my Sakura Micron pen and the color sepia. I feel like it'll be cute to add a little bit of writing in this space, so I just wrote it with pencil first to make sure that the spacing is alright. I'm also going to go over some of the trees, the leaves, and flowers. I'm not going to do this for every single one, I just want some of them to pop out more than others. And of course, I'm just drawing out the outlines very loosely here because I don't want the illustration to have too much of a tight, cartoony feel. Lastly, I'm just going to increase some of the contrast of the shadows again, so I'm going over the areas that I've already painted using a slightly thicker consistency. For some of the pots, I'm also going to add more textures from the shadow. And I actually ended up going over the lighter cast shadow using a slightly darker mix, so it just has a bit more sepia. And I'm just going to try to balance out the rest of the values of this painting. But yeah, that's basically it for this painting. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. I personally just really enjoy painting small whimsical buildings. If you did enjoy this tutorial and would like to see more, please consider subscribing and turn on the notifications so you get notified of new videos that I post every Friday. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!